gonna make him an offer he can't refuse.
I love the smell of napalm in the morning.
Remember shouting those lines with your friends? Loud, proud, and totally convinced you were cool? For every 70s kid, these movie quotes weren't just lines. They were how we joked, bonded, and made sense of growing up. But what happens when the words that shaped us start to fade? Do you remember the moment your heart dropped as Brody backed into the cabin, eyes wide, cigarette clinging to his lip? That single line, "You're gonna need a bigger boat," wasn't just panic. It was truth, plain and brutal. Everyone who grew up watching Jaws knows exactly how it feels to realize you're in way over your head. Brody's calm had carried the scene until that giant shark rose out of the water and the illusion of safety shattered. We all laughed nervously at first, but deep down we knew it was fear talking. It became the quote that outlived the film, said at pool parties, lake trips, and barbecues when anything got too big to handle. A joke? Sure, but with teeth. It captured that specific kind of 70s fear, that the monsters were real and no one was coming to save us. Even now, you say it under your breath when things spiral like a reflex. But what nobody says out loud is that it was never really about the shark. It was about seeing something so much bigger than yourself, and realizing the boat was never enough to begin with. You never forget the first time you heard that rasp. Darth Vader's voice was slow, steady, almost soothing, until it turned cruel. "I find your lack of faith disturbing" wasn't just a flex, it was a death sentence. The man did not yell. He simply decided when you were done talking. For kids in the 70s, Star Wars was a galaxy-sized escape from a world that felt like it was breaking apart. And Vader? He was every scary teacher, every mean boss, every bad dream rolled into one. He didn't argue, he didn't beg, he reached out with the Force and crushed your throat without moving a finger. But here's the thing. We loved it. We mimicked that quote at school, at sleepovers, standing in front of mirrors and trying to get the voice just right. It was cool, it was terrifying, and it made us believe the dark side really was stronger. But as adults, that scene hits different. Vader wasn't just a villain, he was a warning. A quiet, relentless reminder that when power has no limits, it stops asking permission. And maybe what's really disturbing is how much we enjoyed watching it happen. It was not just a chant, it was a scream, a prayer, a desperate cry in the face of the unthinkable. The power of Christ compels you, hit like a hammer in The Exorcist. For kids growing up in religious households or even just religious towns, it shook something deep. It was the first time some of us saw faith used like a weapon. Not quietly, not gently, but violently. The whole room shook. Furniture flew. And in the middle of it all stood Father Marin, drenched in sweat and fury, trying to cast out a demon through sheer force of belief. We watched through our fingers, terrified and fascinated. For days, weeks, years, that phrase echoed, on playgrounds, in whispered jokes, in actual church halls. And while it became a punchline for some, for others it was serious business. That quote made you ask real questions. Did evil actually walk among us? Could words really save us? Or were they just another kind of ritual, one we clung to when we had no control? One thing's for sure, when you hear it now, it still hits you in the chest. Because deep down, we're all still trying to force something dark to leave. Love means never having to say you're sorry. Did it, though? That line from Love Story felt like gospel in 1970. Everyone quoted it, on dates, in movies, even in weddings. Jenny's delivery was soft, bittersweet, final. She was dying, and this was her gift, her truth, her absolution. It sounded beautiful. It looked beautiful. And maybe that's why we never questioned it as kids. But here's the thing. When you grow up, you do. Suddenly that line feels less like wisdom and more like a dare. Because love does mean saying you're sorry. It means saying it a lot, actually. Back then, though, it gave us something to hold on to. In a decade marked by divorce, protest, and deep cultural shifts, people needed a love story that felt pure, even if it hurt. Jenny and Oliver gave them that. And this line was the ribbon tying it all together. But rewatch it now, and you start to hear the sadness in it, the silence it allows. Maybe that's why it stayed with us, because it asked if love could be so strong, it erased the need to apologize. Or maybe it was just a lie we told ourselves to avoid saying the hard things. Adrian! It was not elegant. It was not profound. But in Rocky, that shout cut through everything. The blood, the noise, the chaos. He had made it to the end, bruised and barely standing, and all he wanted was her. For 70s kids, it was the purest declaration of love they had ever seen. Rocky didn't win the fight, but he won. He proved something to himself, to the world, and most of all, to Adrian. And when he shouted her name, every kid watching understood what mattered most. It wasn't the title, it was the connection. This was the decade where underdogs mattered, where grit counted more than polish. And Rocky, with his swollen face and hoarse voice, became our hero not because he beat Apollo, but because he still had someone to shout for. We yelled Adrian into echoing hallways, across playgrounds, down city streets. It was fun. It was loud. It felt real. But looking back now, it's also tender. That moment is about finding your person, even when everything else feels broken. And in a time when life felt uncertain, that kind of clarity meant everything. I want you to hold it between your knees. It sounds ridiculous out of context, but in 5 Easy Pieces, that one line was pure rebellion. Bobby, tired and cornered, goes off on a waitress over a sandwich order. It is petty, it is dramatic, it is unforgettable. For kids who grew up watching their parents rage against conformity, this moment was a release valve. Jack Nicholson didn't just push back, he exploded. It was messy, uncomfortable, and impossible to look away from. We did not always understand the scene as kids, but we felt the fire in it. It gave a face to frustration, to the weird, ugly emotions bubbling under the surface. And for some of us, it was the first time we realized adults did not always have it together. They got mad, they snapped, they said wild things that made no sense, but somehow still felt true. That quote became shorthand for not putting up with anyone's nonsense. But the irony? Bobby wasn't a hero. He was lost, angry, drowning in his own bitterness. And maybe that was the point. Sometimes the quotes we remember best are the ones that made us most uncomfortable. I'm going to make him an offer he can't refuse. It sounded like charm. But everyone watching The Godfather knew it meant something else entirely. Don Corleone did not need to raise his voice. The threat was in the silence, in the pause before and after the words. This quote was burned into every 70s kid's brain. We used it jokingly, of course, at school, in the car, anytime we wanted to sound cool. But there was power in it, and we knew it. For children raised on fairy tales, The Godfather was something different. Brutal, elegant, quiet. The violence was always suggested before it was shown. And this line became the key to understanding how the mafia worked, not with chaos, but with control. As we got older, that quote changed. It started to sound more like business than crime, more like negotiation than threat. And that's the genius of it. Don Corleone offered something, then took away your choice. And it made us all wonder, how often have we been given an offer that we couldn't really refuse either? Keep your friends close, but your enemies closer. Michael Corleone said it like a whisper, not to scare you, but to remind you. This quote from The Godfather Part 2 was not shouted, not explained. It just was. It felt ancient, like something passed down from emperors and warlords. And in a way, it was. Michael had turned into something cold, calculated, devastatingly precise. Kids who watched the movie might not have grasped the full weight of it then. But the quote stuck anyway. It made its way into conversations, strategy games, even schoolyard rivalries. Because it sounded smart. It sounded like power. But as the years went by, we started to hear the loneliness in it too. Michael trusted no one, not even family, especially not family. And that was the cost of knowing too much, seeing too clearly. For a decade obsessed with loyalty and betrayal, after Watergate, after Vietnam, this line hit like a truth nobody wanted to admit. We wrote it in notebooks, we quoted it to sound wise. But deep down we knew, keeping enemies close means pushing everyone else away. Life is a cabaret, old chum. Come to the cabaret. Sally Bowles sang it with glitter in her eyes and sadness in her bones. This wasn't just a show tune from Cabaret. It was defiance. It was survival. For 70s kids, it became a way to smile through the chaos. The line echoed from disco clubs to drama classrooms. You could say it loud, sing it soft, or toss it like a joke. Either way, it meant something. Sally wasn't telling you life was fun. She was telling you to pretend it was, because sometimes that was the only way to keep going. The song was about illusions, about dancing through despair, and that tension made it unforgettable. We wanted the sparkle, but we saw the cracks too. That quote became a lifeline in tough times, a little reminder to put on the show, even when the curtain feels too heavy to lift. And maybe that's why it has lasted so long. Not because it's hopeful, but because it knows exactly how much pretending it takes to keep singing. Attica, Attica. It was not a quote, it was a war cry. Al Pacino, wild-eyed and sweating, turned Dog Day Afternoon into something bigger than a bank robbery. His character Sonny wasn't just holding hostages, he was shouting about injustice, about the riot at Attica Prison, about a system that chewed people up and spit them out. For 70s kids, this moment was electric. It felt dangerous, like something you weren't supposed to be watching. And maybe that was the point. It showed how protest could live inside pop culture, loud, raw, impossible to ignore. We mimicked it without always knowing what it meant. But over time, we learned. Attica was real, people died, and Sonny's scream became a bridge between fiction and fact. It gave a name to the anger we couldn't explain. And hearing it now still makes your chest tighten, because some things never stop needing to be shouted. I love the smell of napalm in the morning. You could almost feel the heat coming off the screen when Kilgore said that. He stood barefoot on a beach, watching destruction like it was some kind of sunrise. To a kid in the 70s, that scene in Apocalypse Now felt surreal, because it was. War was still a fresh wound, and here was a man romanticizing the smell of death. It was terrifying. It was mesmerizing. And most of all, it was unforgettable. Kilgore wasn't evil. He was numb. That line revealed how war twists the human mind until horror feels like routine. We laughed at how over-the-top it sounded, but part of us understood it too. We saw it quoted in parodies, cartoons, even commercials. But deep down, the quote stayed disturbing. Because it was not a punchline. It was a truth no one wanted to admit. That violence had become normal, even beautiful to some. And hearing it now makes you wonder, how much destruction does it take before someone starts calling it a good morning? Is it safe? At first, it sounded innocent, like someone asking about the weather. But in Marathon Man, it turned into the scariest question a kid could hear. Zell's soft voice, that calm repetition, it was worse than yelling. It crawled under your skin because you knew what came next, the drill, the pain, the scream. 70s kids did not need to understand politics or diamonds to be traumatized by that scene. It was pure nightmare fuel. And that line, 3 little words, became the signal that horror was coming. We joked about it later, sure. Said it at dentists' offices, laughed nervously when someone repeated it, but it never really lost its sting, because it reminded us how evil can sound polite, how danger does not always announce itself with thunder. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it asks questions. And when you hear, "Is it safe?" now, your stomach still tightens. Because it never was, and maybe it never will be. Forget it, Jake. It's Chinatown. The words were quiet, almost tired. Not dramatic, not emotional, just resigned. and somehow that made them hurt even more. Chinatown ended not with justice, but with surrender. And for a kid in the 70s, that felt new. That line marked the moment when everything fell apart, and nobody was going to fix it. Jake had fought, struggled, tried to make sense of it all, but the system was too deep, too dirty. And when Walsh says those words, it is not just about Chinatown, it is about every broken thing in the world you cannot change. We repeated it when things went wrong, said it like a joke when we got in trouble or lost a game. But it was never really funny, because it meant giving up. It meant looking at something awful and walking away. That line has stuck around for decades, not because it's clever, but because it feels true. And maybe what's worst of all is how easy it is to start believing it. I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore. You did not just hear it, you felt it. Howard Beale's voice cracked open the television like a scream through the static. In network, this was not just a line, it was a meltdown, a warning, a revolution. And in the 70s, it rang out like an anthem. For kids growing up in a world of layoffs, inflation, and endless bad news, it was cathartic. Adults were supposed to have it together. Beale didn't, and that made him ours. We quoted it on rooftops. We shouted it into fans. We muttered it under our breath when life pushed too hard. But the genius of the line is that it feels real and absurd. It is angry, but also helpless. Loud, but strangely hollow. Like shouting into a storm and hoping the clouds listen. Watching it now, it still feels urgent, but also sad. Because we know that being mad as hell is not always enough. Sometimes you scream, and nothing changes. I realized what was living behind that boy's eyes was purely and simply evil. Dr. Loomis did not shout it. He did not panic. He just stated it, like a doctor reading off a chart. And somehow that made it worse. In Halloween, this line introduced us to the idea that some people cannot be saved, that evil could wear a child's face and grow into something even colder. For kids in the 70s, Michael Myers was different from the monsters we were used to. He did not speak. He did not explain. And this quote gave that silence meaning. We repeated the line in hushed tones, especially around October. It made us feel brave, like we understood something dark. But underneath the thrill was fear, not of masks or knives, but of the idea that some people are born wrong. Loomis's diagnosis felt final. No cure, no hope. And even now, when we hear those words, they chill us. Because they hint at a truth we still do not want to face. That some horrors do not come from the outside. They come from within. It's all for you, Damien. Then the jump, the fall, the silence. That scene in The Omen hit like a slap. One moment it was a kid's birthday party. The next, it was something else entirely. We were not ready. No one was. And that line, shouted with devotion, love even, was the worst part. Because it was not hate that made the nanny do it. It was faith. Twisted, warped, but sincere. For 70s kids, it was a terrifying lesson. That danger can come wrapped in a smile. That someone can ruin everything and still think they are doing good. We quoted it to freak out friends, to spook siblings, but deep down, we remembered the look on her face, that certainty, that sacrifice, and it haunted us because it meant evil could inspire loyalty, could make people do the unthinkable in its name. And every time we hear that line now, we wonder, how far would someone go? If they believed it was all for us? Toga, toga! It was loud, it was dumb, it was perfect. Animal House gave us the kind of college fantasy that felt just close enough to believe. And Bluto, John Belushi, with his wild eyes and toga made from a bedsheet, led the charge. That chant turned a food fight into a movement. Suddenly, every school dance, every basement party, every bad idea had a soundtrack. 70s kids were already feeling the walls close in. Rules, dress codes, expectations. This quote was the opposite of all that. It was freedom wrapped in chaos. We yelled it even if we had never seen the movie, because we felt what it meant. To let go, to be ridiculous, to not care if anyone was watching. But as adults, we can also see what was lurking underneath. The longing to belong, to matter, to feel alive in a world that wanted you quiet. Toga was not just a party chant. It was a middle finger to the ordinary. And even now, it makes you want to throw on a sheet and run through the halls one more time. "They're all gonna laugh at you," it echoed. It stabbed. It predicted everything. In Carrie, Margaret White's shrill warning sounded ridiculous at first, overbearing, insane. But then prom night came, and the laughter did too. For 70s kids, this quote was more than horror. It was a mirror. It tapped into every fear of humiliation, of being seen and rejected. We had all felt like Carrie at some point. We all knew what it was like to dread being laughed at. That line became shorthand for paranoia, for that tiny voice in your head that turns every glance into mockery. We said it at parties, in locker rooms, half joking but never fully, because we understood it. And that was the genius of it. Margaret's words were toxic, but they were not wrong. They were self-fulfilling, and they reminded us how cruelty spreads, how laughter, once sweet, can curdle into something sharp. Hear that line now, and it still stings, because it whispers the one question no teenager ever wants to ask out loud. What if they really are? Follow the money. 3 simple words. No drama, no chase scenes, just advice. But in All the President's Men, they led to everything. Watergate, cover-ups, the truth. For 70s kids living through political scandal, this quote cut through the noise. It sounded smart. Director, inevitable. Deep Throat did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The line landed like a hammer. And we repeated it for years, not just about politics, but about anything suspicious. It became a mantra, a shortcut for figuring out who was lying, where the real story was. But the deeper meaning stuck too. That power hides in plain sight. That money connects every shady deal, every buried headline. And if you keep pulling the thread, you might unravel something huge. That quote taught us how to be skeptics, how to question what we were told, and today, it feels more relevant than ever. Because if you really want to understand how the world works, you still have to follow the money. "You've got me? Who's got you?" It was said in awe, not fear. Lois Lane had just fallen from a helicopter, and instead of hitting the ground, she stopped midair, suspended, safe. Superman held her, but she could barely speak, and that line, delivered like a laugh, a gasp, a thank you, captured the magic of the moment. For kids in the 70s, it was unforgettable. This was not a gritty anti-hero. This was wonder. This was flight. This was hope. And that quote summed it up perfectly. We repeated it with wide eyes, dreaming of capes and rescues. It made us believe someone out there might catch us too. But as we got older, the line changed. It became less about Superman and more about trust, about what happens when you give up control. Lois let go. She fell. And someone was there. Now, when we hear it, we do not just remember the hero. We remember the feeling of being caught. And for a world that often feels like it is falling, that still means everything. "You talking to me?" No one else was. That was the point. Alone in his apartment, Travis Bickle faced the mirror like it owed him something. For kids in the 70s, this scene in Taxi Driver felt dangerous because it looked familiar. A man talking to himself, imagining some final showdown. He wanted to matter, to be seen. That line echoed in bedrooms and basements, performed by teenagers who did not quite know why it felt powerful. We thought it was cool, edgy, intense. But really, it was about loneliness. About how far someone might go to make the world pay attention. Travis rehearsed like it was a play, like violence could fill in the blanks of a broken life. The quote outlived the movie. It became a meme before memes existed, but the weight of it still lingers. Because we all talk to mirrors sometimes. We all want to feel ready for something big. And that line reminds us, when no one answers back, the silence gets loud. "Do you feel lucky, punk?" He said it calm, too calm. Dirty Harry was not looking for a fair fight. He was daring the guy to move. That line in Dirty Harry cut right through the theater. Clint Eastwood barely blinked. He did not need to. 70s kids watched in awe as justice turned into a dare. The gun, the squint, the pause. We quoted it constantly, at lunch tables, in parking lots, anywhere we could pretend to be that tough. But as cool as it sounded, it was also loaded, literally and figuratively. The quote balanced on the edge of a bullet. It was about control, power, and the thrill of not knowing. The line blurred between law and vengeance. And it made us cheer anyway, because sometimes in a messy world, you root for someone who plays dirty, even if it scares you, especially if it does. That question still sticks in your head, sharp, smug, unforgettable. And maybe the real question is not whether the criminal feels lucky, but whether you do. Soylent Green is people. He did not whisper it, he screamed it. In Soylent Green, this final line was the punch to the stomach no one saw coming. What started as a slow-burn mystery ended in full-blown horror. 70s kids watched Charlton Heston claw through a dystopian nightmare, only to land on the worst truth imaginable. The food that saved humanity was made of humanity. We said the line in mock terror, made it into jokes. But there was something serious underneath. It captured every anxiety of the time: overpopulation, pollution, the fear that the future would eat us alive. This was not just science fiction, it was prophecy. And that scream became iconic because it said the quiet part out loud. We remembered it because it felt possible, still does. Whenever someone uncovers a dark truth, we hear that line again, even if only in our heads, because once you know, you cannot unknow it. What knockers? The thunder hits, the music swells, and just when things are getting spooky, young Frankenstein slams the door open, on a joke. It is dumb. It is brilliant. It is Mel Brooks. When Dr. Frankenstein admires Inga's knockers, she thanks him, assuming he meant the door hardware. For 70s kids, this moment was pure gold. We rewound the tape. We quoted it endlessly. It was the kind of joke you told just to see if someone got it. And the best part? It never got old. Because it was not just about the punchline, it was about the timing, the delivery, the wink. That line captured everything we loved about parody. Smart people doing stupid things in smart ways. Even now, it hits just right. Maybe because it lets us laugh at horror, or maybe because it reminds us that a little silliness goes a long way. I'm just a sweet transvestite. The music starts, the elevator opens, and Tim Curry owns the room. In the Rocky Horror Picture Show, this line was more than a song lyric. It was an entrance, a statement, a declaration of identity. For 70s kids sneaking into midnight showings, it was a thrill, dangerous, liberating, hilarious. Frankenfurter was everything we had never seen and could not look away from. We sang the line out loud, in costume, in secret. It felt like being part of something bigger, something weird and wonderful. This was not just a quote. It was a revolution in lipstick and heels. We did not always understand it, but we felt it. It gave permission. It gave power. And even now, when you hear those first few words, you smile. Because no matter who you are, that moment says, it is okay to be different. In fact, it is fabulous. Tell me about it, stud. The hair, the heels, the cigarette. Sandy was not the same girl anymore. At the end of Grease, she turns the tables, and everyone in the theater gasped. 70s kids had watched her go from shy to unstoppable in one scene flat. That line? It sealed the deal. Delivered with a wink and a strut, it said everything without trying. It was the kind of makeover that rewrote the rules. We did not just watch it, we felt like we lived it. We repeated it with smirks, sometimes in front of mirrors. It was flirtation as power. It was transformation in 4 words. But here is what made it last. It surprised us. Sandy did not change for Danny. She changed for herself. At least that is how we saw it. Even if the message was messy, the moment was iconic. And now, when we hear it, we remember the thrill of a good reveal, of becoming someone new and owning it. Why are there so many songs about rainbows? The voice was soft. The question was real. In the Muppet movie, Kermit sang it like he already knew the answer but wanted to ask anyway. For kids in the 70s, this line was a hug. It felt safe, gentle, hopeful. Rainbows were not just pretty, they were promises. And Kermit, with his banjo and big eyes, became a kind of dream guide. It made the world feel a little softer, even if you did not understand why. Sometimes a frog with a song was all it took to make you believe. We sang the song until we knew it by heart. That first line opened something in us. Wonder, curiosity, a need to believe. And even now, it still does, because it reminds us to look up, to keep asking questions, and to believe that somewhere, there really is something waiting at the end. I was born a poor black child. Steve Martin says it with such sincerity, you almost forget how ridiculous it is. In The Jerk, that line opens the movie like a slap and a smirk. 70s kids laughed hard and kept quoting it, often without knowing why it worked so well. It was absurd, uncomfortable, brilliant. Navin's cluelessness was the joke, but the delivery made it genius. That first line told you everything about the tone, bold, weird, and completely self-aware. It was comedy with a straight face, and that made it hit harder. We were laughing, but part of us wondered if we were supposed to. We said it in classrooms, locker rooms, family dinners. It shocked adults. It cracked up friends. But it also revealed something sharp beneath the humor. About identity, about assumptions, about how wild it is to misunderstand yourself so fully. And maybe that is why it still hits today, because behind the laughter is a little voice saying, how well do any of us really know who we are? The Bigalow Theater was one of those brief glimmers in television history that seemed to burn too brightly and too fast. Airing from 1950 to 1951, it lived a strange dual life, first as a CBS anthology drama and later repackaged for Dumont under various names. At its core, it was a stage for stories, real ones, deep ones, sometimes even a little too ambitious for their times. Each episode was a self-contained play, complete with rising tension and dramatic conclusions that tried to stretch the television format beyond its early limits. But here's what sets it apart: the talent it attracted. A young James Dean appeared on it before he became legend. George C. Scott showed up long before anyone called him iconic. For one brief, shining moment, the Bigalow Theater was a springboard for greatness. It was the kind of show that didn't just cast actors, it captured them at the edge of becoming icons. There was a rawness in the performances, a feeling that no one quite knew they were making history. Every episode felt like a rehearsal for something much bigger, but no less sincere. And because of that, it became a quiet archive of American talent right before it exploded. But it never quite caught the public's imagination in the way its network hoped. It lacked flash. It asked its viewers to pay attention, to feel something. That was a lot to ask from a post-war America that just wanted to laugh or sing. And so it faded, quietly, almost politely, into television's attic of forgotten names. But those performances, those early, trembling moments of greatness, they remain buried in dusty kinescopes, just waiting for someone to remember. It had glitz, it had charm, and it had the Las Vegas Strip, but it never had the audience. Who's Watching the Kids was a sitcom that centered on two aspiring showgirls trying to make it big in Sin City while raising their younger siblings in the process. The idea alone seemed like a classic blend of heartfelt family drama and zany showbiz antics. It had neon, sequins, and sass, along with the tried-and-true formula of mismatched roommates balancing dreams and responsibility. But the series never found its footing. The humor felt thin. The stories leaned heavily on awkward misunderstandings and slapstick gags that even the laugh track could not salvage. The kids were mostly relegated to the background, and the adult characters lacked the warmth that audiences were used to from family-centric shows. NBC hoped it would capture the same lightning that made Laverne and Shirley a hit, especially since it came from the same producers. But it missed the heart, and it missed the timing. Audiences in the late 1970s were already shifting toward more grounded, character-driven sitcoms. The over-the-top Vegas flair and cartoonish setups just felt out of touch. Ratings declined quickly. After only 11 episodes, the show was quietly pulled. It has since faded into near-total obscurity. For a show that promised both showbiz sparkle and family tenderness, it managed to deliver neither. Watching it now feels like digging up a discarded script from a past that tried too hard to be funny without ever being real. A footnote in television history, barely remembered, but maybe, just maybe, that is for the best. What if you took Annie, mashed it with the Brady Bunch, then threw in spontaneous musical numbers sung in full costume? That is Rags to Riches, a show that asked, what if orphans could sing doo-wop every time they had a feeling? And for some reason, the answer worked, at least for a little while. The story goes like this. A self-made millionaire named Nick Foley unexpectedly ends up adopting 6 orphan girls from the 1960s and tries to raise them in his mansion. Except he is not exactly the soft-hearted type. He is gruff, impatient, allergic to sentiment, but over time, of course, they all warm up to each other. That would have been a solid family sitcom right there. But Rags to Riches goes further, way further, because at least once or twice an episode, the girls burst into song. Not just humming. Full-blown musical performances using reworded versions of classic pop hits to match whatever emotional situation they were in. You would think this would be a gimmick, and it kind of was. But the wild part? It had real heart. The show somehow balanced the over-the-top charm of musical fantasy with grounded stories about family, trust, and identity. These were kids who had lost everything. And suddenly they were navigating prep schools, fancy parties, and emotional roller coasters, all while singing about it. The performances were cheesy, sure, but full of joy. The cast gave it their all, whether they were dealing with a school bully or dancing through a heartbreak. And the music? Catchy, sometimes weirdly perfect. Somehow, Stop, in the Name of Love became a heartfelt cry about being accepted. It was bizarre and oddly brilliant. Rags to Riches only ran for 2 seasons. It never quite found its audience, maybe because it lived between too many genres. But the people who watched it never forgot, because it dared to be something strange and sentimental at the same time. It wore its emotions on its sleeve and then sang them at you. Rags to Riches was 1 part musical, 1 part sitcom, and all parts heartfelt chaos. And that is exactly why it is too good to forget. You're under arrest, sugar. That was the catchphrase that made America sit up and take notice, if only briefly. Get Christy Love was revolutionary in its time, featuring one of television's first black female leads in a crime drama. Teresa Graves starred as Christy Love, an undercover detective in a world that was still figuring out how to talk about race, power, and gender. She was smart, tough, stylish, and unforgettable. The show was based loosely on a made-for-television movie, which drew major buzz. ABC thought they had the next big hit on their hands, and for a moment, it seemed like they did. But then the cracks began to show. The scripts were formulaic, the action routine, and the production values limited. Christy Love was meant to be bold, but the stories rarely let her break out of tired cliches. Behind the scenes, Graves, who had converted to a religious faith, refused to participate in any scenes she felt were too violent or provocative. Creative clashes followed. The network struggled to find the right tone. Ratings dipped, and by the end of its first season, the show was gone. What should have been a trailblazer was reduced to a footnote. Still, Christy Love carved out a place in history. She opened a door that had been shut for too long, even if she did not get to walk all the way through it. Today, she is remembered more for what she represented than for the plots she solved. A symbol of potential unrealized, a legend born from a show that never had the chance to grow. Aliens in the Family was one of those shows that made you do a double take. Part puppet show, part live-action sitcom. It was a science fiction oddity that aired on ABC in 1996. It followed a blended family, half human, half alien, trying to live together under one roof. Think The Brady Bunch meets The Muppets, with a dash of outer space weirdness. It was colorful, chaotic, and completely offbeat, and audiences had no idea what to do with it. Children were confused, parents were indifferent, critics were baffled. The puppet characters, created by Jim Henson's Creature Shop, were impressive, but the tone of the show constantly bounced between wacky and heartfelt, never quite landing on either. One moment, you had alien dad jokes and slapstick burps, and the next, you had tearful lessons about acceptance and identity. It didn't just blur tones, it erased the lines completely. In doing so, it gave some kids their first glimpse of what it meant to feel different and still be loved. The jokes often missed. The emotional moments felt too strange to sink in. But under all the eccentricity was something unique, an attempt to talk about blended families, about difference and acceptance, through the lens of weird intergalactic humor. It was bold. Too bold, maybe. Only a handful of episodes aired before it was quietly pulled from the schedule. It has since become a punchline in weird TV retrospectives. But there is a generation of viewers who caught those few episodes wide-eyed, wondering if they had imagined the whole thing. For them, it was not just bizarre, it was oddly touching. The show tried to say something about what makes a family, and how love looks different across space and species. You would think that turning one of the most successful comedies of all time into a television show would be a sure thing. But Delta House proved just how quickly lightning can escape the bottle. Based on the hit movie Animal House, this series tried to translate the chaos, raunch, and rebellion of the big screen into a weekly sitcom, only now under the watchful eye of network censors. And it showed. Gone were the wild parties, the edge, and the sense of danger. What remained was a watered-down echo of what once made people howl with laughter. Some of the original cast returned, including John Vernon as the uptight Dean Wormer, but without John Belushi's magnetic presence, the show felt like a tribute act. The humor was neutered. The stories went nowhere. ABC hoped that the mere association with the movie would be enough to draw in fans, but those fans were not fooled. This was not the Animal House they remembered. Ratings started strong but fell quickly. The characters, once riotous and wild, now felt flat and safe. Within 13 episodes, the show was off the air. Critics called it forgettable. Even the network seemed eager to move on. Delta House became another example of how television sometimes strangles the very spirit it hopes to bottle. You cannot fake irreverence, and you definitely cannot sanitize rebellion. Today, it is a curiosity, remembered mostly by die-hard fans and trivia buffs, a show that tried to cash in on chaos and wound up lost in the quiet. It was one of those shows that should have faded into parody, but somehow carved out a place in America's living rooms, and never really left. The Beverly Hillbillies followed the Clampett family, simple folks from the Ozarks who struck oil and suddenly found themselves living in a Beverly Hills mansion they could not understand, surrounded by wealth they never asked for. The comedy was obvious, their backward ways clashing with the glittering absurdity of high society. But beneath the laughs was something quieter, something almost tragic. This was a story about people who never quite fit in, no matter how big their bank account got. Jed Clampett, the soft-spoken patriarch, always seemed like he was looking for something he had lost, even as the world laughed around him. Granny's wild wisdom and Ellie Mae's innocence made them caricatures on the surface, but real to anyone who knew what it meant to be treated like a joke just for being different. And America watched, week after week, because it reminded us that not every outsider is looking to blend in. But then, just like that, the Clampetts were gone. One day they were gracing prime time, the next they were a punchline, buried beneath newer shows with shinier backdrops and faster jokes. The laugh track stopped, and no one asked why. Today, the Beverly Hillbillies exists mostly in rerun limbo, a relic with a twang, treated like a fossil of a simpler time. But if you remember sitting cross-legged on the carpet, watching Granny try to make moonshine in a millionaire's kitchen, then you remember what television used to be. odd, imperfect, human. And sometimes that was exactly what made it so rich. There was a time in the early 80s when television dared to be quiet, slow, even a little meditative. That is what The Phoenix was, a show about an ancient alien named Bennu who wakes up in the middle of modern-day America, wrapped in gold fabric and calm wisdom, like a cosmic monk who accidentally overslept. And yes, he had powers. But they were not laser beams and explosions kind of powers. They were soft, gentle, a little mysterious. Bennu came from a long-lost alien civilization, and his mission was not to fight crime or blow up asteroids. It was to search for his companion, a woman named Mira, and maybe, just maybe, help save the Earth from itself. He could heal people with his hands. He could speak ancient languages. He could sense danger through his glowing amulet. And when he walked into a scene, he did not run. He just moved slowly, like he was already at peace, and the rest of the world needed to catch up. That is not exactly the kind of premise that screams prime-time hit. But that was never the point. The Phoenix had this almost spiritual tone, like science fiction dipped in ancient myth. Bennu was less like Superman and more like a wandering sage. And instead of flashy battles, episodes often ended with emotional conversations, second chances, and people learning something about themselves. It was not always perfectly executed. The pacing could be strange, some scenes dragged, and the special effects, well, they were what you would expect from 1982 television on a budget. But for all its flaws, there was something oddly beautiful about it. It felt like a bedtime story for grown-ups, a show that asked you to slow down, breathe, and listen. And it never got the chance to bloom. Only 5 episodes aired before it vanished. Just 5. But those who watched it remember the feeling, the music, the strange, peaceful presence of Bennu. It felt different. And sometimes, different is exactly what sticks. The Phoenix was not loud, but it still managed to leave an echo. A weird, glowing, golden echo. And that is exactly why it is too good to forget. There was a time when the Starlost was supposed to be a game changer, a Canadian-American science fiction epic created by legendary author Harlan Ellison. It promised something rare for television in the early 1970s, a deep, thoughtful exploration of humanity's future. The premise was solid. Earth had been destroyed. The last of humanity lived aboard a gigantic space ark, divided into sealed biospheres, each preserving a different culture. But the execution? That was another story entirely. Everything that could go wrong did. The budget was slashed early in production. Sets were cheap, effects were amateurish, dialogue dragged on endlessly, and characters stumbled through episodes that felt like half-finished thoughts. Ellison was so disillusioned he removed his name from the credits. What was meant to be a rich, compelling universe became a series of dimly lit rooms filled with awkward pacing and empty revelations. Viewers who tuned in expecting the next Star Trek found themselves stranded in a slow-moving dream where nothing ever really happened. Ratings fell, critics turned cold, and by the end of its short run, just 16 episodes, the Starlost had become a cautionary tale, a reminder that big ideas are not enough without the tools to bring them to life. It remains a fascinating failure. It is the kind of show that leaves behind more questions than answers, and perhaps that is why some still seek it out today. Not to enjoy it, but to witness the fall of something that could have been great, a star that never quite made it into orbit. The Texas Wheelers was a sitcom that aired for a blink in time, just 4 episodes in 1974 before it disappeared from the airwaves. It told the story of a widowed father, Zach Wheeler, played by Jack Elam, trying to raise his 4 kids in rural Texas after returning home. The tone was rough around the edges but warm at the core, an unusual blend of grit and sentiment. One of the kids was played by a young Mark Hamill just before the world would know him as Luke Skywalker. But even that bit of trivia was not enough to save the show. It premiered during a time when audiences were craving escapism, not slice-of-life realism wrapped in Southern grit. The laugh track felt out of place. The characters talked more than they joked. There was a quiet honesty in every scene, moments that felt like they came from someone's real life, not a writer's room. The show made no effort to dazzle or distract. It just wanted to sit with you and tell the truth. It was less about punchlines and more about pauses, silences, and hard-earned smiles. And instead of punchlines, there were long, quiet moments of reflection. Maybe too many. The Texas Wheelers did not fail because it was bad. It failed because it was honest. And in 1974, honest sitcoms did not get very far. But those who remember it remember something rare. A network show that tried to say something deeper under its dusty boots and denim jackets. It had an emotional backbone. It wanted to show how family bonds are messy, complicated, and not always tied together with a neat bow. Its cancellation felt like closing the book before the first chapter was over. Yet in those few episodes, there was something sincere, something that lingers. The kind of sincerity that could only be appreciated years later. Sometimes even science fiction needs a laugh, but Quark never quite found its punchline. This short-lived series tried to parody the genre just as Star Wars fever was gripping the world. It followed a garbage collector in space, Adam Quark, and his bizarre crew aboard a sanitation ship cleaning up interstellar waste. There were clones, robots, alien princesses, and lots of fourth wall-breaking one-liners. The tone was weird, the jokes even weirder. Creator Buck Henry had helped launch Saturday Night Live, and there was hope he could bottle that same absurd genius for network television. But what worked in sketch form did not always translate into 25-minute episodes. Quark constantly wavered between satire and silliness. It poked fun at Star Trek and science fiction cliches, but without much love or warmth for the material it mocked. Some gags were clever, others felt like leftovers. The laugh track made it worse, dulling any potential edge. Critics were puzzled, audiences were indifferent. NBC shuffled its time slot, hoping something would stick. Nothing did. After just 8 episodes, the show was canceled. But for a brief moment, Quark had aimed for something unique, a space comedy before that was really a thing. And maybe that was the problem. It was ahead of its time, or maybe just off-key. Watching it now, you can see flashes of brilliance under the bad wigs and rubber aliens. But you can also feel the weight of a show that never figured out how to balance satire with storytelling. Quark vanished almost as quickly as it arrived, leaving behind only static in the void. There was something strange and beautiful about this show, like a bedtime story wrapped in a sitcom. Nanny and the Professor was about a mysterious English nanny named Phoebe Figalili, who arrived out of nowhere to care for the chaotic household of Professor Everett and his 3 kids. She had an air of magic about her, never overt, never explained, but always understood. This was not a flashy show. There were no laugh tracks forcing you to find it funny, no obvious special effects screaming for attention. Instead, it asked you to believe, to trust that sometimes the people who save us do not come with explanations. They just show up quietly, like Nanny did, and make life a little better without asking for anything in return. There were whispers that she was psychic. Some thought she was a witch, but it never mattered. What mattered was that she taught 3 kids and a tired, widowed professor how to feel joy again. And for a brief moment in television history, that kind of emotional rescue was enough. When the show ended after just 2 seasons, it left behind a strange sense of unresolved wonder. We never found out who Nanny really was. Maybe that was the point. Some people are not meant to stay. They just pass through when you need them most. Like a childhood memory you can almost remember, but not quite. There is something about growing up in the late 80s that made weird feel normal. Case in point, Out of This World. A teen girl named Evie discovers on her 13th birthday that she is half alien. Not the green kind with antennas. Her dad is from a distant planet and she inherited his powers. What powers? Oh, nothing major. Just freezing time with her fingers, talking to a disembodied cube on her nightstand, and learning to control the universe one day at a time. Totally average teen stuff, right? Out of This World lived in that beautiful space between bizarre and wholesome. It looked like your standard family sitcom at first. Single mom, suburban house, best friend who always gets into trouble. But then you would blink and Evie would stop time to avoid doing her homework, or pause the whole world to fix a social disaster at school. And sometimes she would have full conversations with her alien dad through a glowing plastic cube that lit up in rainbow colors and spoke with the voice of Burt Reynolds. Yes, Burt Reynolds. The show never really explained how it all worked. The alien stuff was just accepted. No one asked too many questions. That was the magic of it. It did not need to make sense. It just needed to make you smile. And it did. Every time Evie tried to help someone and made everything worse. Every time her mom reminded her to be more human than alien. Every time the laugh track rolled over a moment that was actually kind of sweet. There were episodes about growing up, friendship, peer pressure, even jealousy, all filtered through the lens of a girl who could literally stop the world. But somehow, it never felt preachy. It felt light, relatable, even when it made no sense at all. Because Evie was not perfect. She was awkward and kind and trying her best. And if you were a kid watching, you felt like maybe you had powers too, just different ones. It ran for 4 seasons, quietly carving out its place in television history. And even if people do not bring it up much today, the ones who watched it remember. They remember the finger-point freeze, the cube's glowing voice, the way it made growing up feel a little more magical. Out of This World was sci-fi wrapped in comfort, and that is exactly why it is too good to forget. Sometimes even science fiction needs a laugh, but Quark never quite found its punchline. This short-lived series tried to parody the genre just as Star Wars fever was gripping the world. It followed a garbage collector in space, Adam Quark, and his bizarre crew aboard a sanitation ship cleaning up interstellar waste. There were clones, robots, alien princesses, and lots of fourth wall-breaking one-liners. The tone was weird, the jokes even weirder. Creator Buck Henry had helped launch Saturday Night Live, and there was hope he could bottle that same absurd genius for network television. But what worked in sketch form did not always translate into 25-minute episodes. Quark constantly wavered between satire and silliness. It poked fun at Star Trek and science fiction cliches, but without much love or warmth for the material it mocked. Some gags were clever, others felt like leftovers. The laugh track made it worse, dulling any potential edge. Critics were puzzled. Audiences were indifferent. NBC shuffled its time slot, hoping something would stick. Nothing did. After just 8 episodes, the show was canceled. But for a brief moment, Quark had aimed for something unique, a space comedy before that was really a thing. And maybe that was the problem. It was ahead of its time, or maybe just off-key. Watching it now, you can see flashes of brilliance under the bad wigs and rubber aliens. But you can also feel the weight of a show that never figured out how to balance satire with storytelling. Quark vanished almost as quickly as it arrived, leaving behind only static in the void. Sliders was one of those rare science fiction shows that handed its audience the keys to the multiverse, and then quietly slipped out the back door. Premiering in 1995, the series followed a group of travelers who slid between parallel universes, each one slightly or wildly different from their own. It was clever, imaginative, and packed with potential. One world would be ruled by technology, another by communism. Some were utopias, most were nightmares. The concept was lightning in a bottle. But television, as always, is complicated. Behind the scenes, the show was plagued by network meddling, cast changes, and creative clashes. What started as thoughtful science fiction turned slowly into formulaic adventure. One of the show's greatest strengths was its premise. What if one decision created a whole new world? That idea alone had enough weight to carry 10 seasons, if not more. But too often, the show's smartest ideas got buried beneath budget cuts and behind-the-scenes drama. It bounced from Fox to the Sci-Fi Channel, and in the process, lost its rhythm. Characters were written off, the tone shifted, and that initial sense of wonder, the thrill of infinite possibilities, got buried under clunky plot lines. Still, for those who watched it, Sliders was unforgettable. The idea that there were versions of our world just a step away lit up the imagination. It made you question the smallest choices. The what-ifs. The roads not taken. And even now, in a media landscape drowning in multiverse stories, Sliders is rarely mentioned. It was a pioneer without a monument. A bold idea that came before audiences were ready and was gone before they could catch up. Which of these quotes still lives rent-free in your head? And if you smiled, shouted, or whispered any of them under your breath, go ahead and drop your favorite in the comments, tap like, and hit subscribe so you never miss the lines that made us.